Happy Friday, everybody. So this video, we are going to be talking about astrology that's happening today. It's kicking off this weekend. However, it is going to be astrology that will be coloring the entire month of November. Much like we talked about the last video, Venus in Libra now covering the rest of this month as well. We now have Mercury, which has ingressed into Sagittarius, and that kicks off our weekend. However, there is a lot more astrology that is very important to talk about. So let's get started with how we're kicking off this weekend. Mercury moving into Sagittarius and squaring Saturn. All right, so let's start with the basics, right? So for those of you who are more advanced, sorry, but I want to make sure that this is accessible for everybody. So when we're talking about Mercury, we're talking about looking at the minute details, like the data. It wants to know. It wants to know all of the details. And when we're looking at Sagittarius in contrast, Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. Sagittarius is like expansive. It wants to look at the big picture, right? There's a lot more to both of these, to that planet and to the sign. However, in this case, when we're combining them, this is the most relevant information that I feel like I can put in a succinct little package for everybody, right? So when we're looking at the two of them together, there's this tendency for Mercury to want to be like, I want to focus on the details, but I feel like I'm struggling to maybe see or fit this into the big picture. Maybe the forest for the trees kind of analogy fits into this particular space. So it's interesting because this is something that I'm still working with inside of astrology, but Mercury is supposed to be not in the best place when it's in Sagittarius. However, I might be biased because I have my Mercury in Sagittarius. I find it to be a really fun and explorative type of experience. So my experience, and I don't know if this is helpful, but my experience of Mercury in Sagittarius is that it feels like I want to talk Mercury. Like I want to talk about big ideas. I want to talk about the big ideas and how we can put them into categories and understand them and compartmentalize them, but then bring them all together into this really big picture. And sometimes I can get lost in that. And sometimes that's really fun and useful and exciting. It's like a journey. So take that as you will. Some people, I think, relate to it maybe differently, but it's supposed to be not doing its best when it is in Sagittarius. So there's that to consider. We could say that maybe part of that could be like somebody communicating in a very blunt way about the wisdoms that they feel they have acquired. So very like blunt wisdom. I could see that. I could see that. I could definitely see that, especially in somebody who's like maybe just in this particular moment really excited and not so very conscious of like reading the room, right? Or reading just reading the room. Let's leave it at that. So that is going to be in Sagittarius. Mercury is going to be in Sagittarius all the way through to the end of November. So we get to have this here. And I say get to because, again, I see this as something that is interesting, fun to play with. So depending on you and your personality, you might see that differently. Now, we have another thing to talk about. So as far as this weekend goes, how this starts off is everything that I just talked about, yes. However, when we have Mercury that ingresses into Sagittarius today on Friday, the 10th, I had to look at my watch for that. On the 10th, we have it immediately in a square with Saturn, right? And squares are challenging aspects, right? They bring in some tension, some type of friction, right? So when we're looking at the two of them in a square, we could say that part of that means that through today, which you may have already been experiencing. I wish I could have gotten this video out earlier. I'm sorry. I just had a really busy day. So into tomorrow, at least a little bit, like lingering, right? There is this kind of quality of maybe delayed responses with people, like slower kind of communication, right? Like the Saturn quality can really slow the communication down or create delays in that, right? Another thing that I see there is that we can experience coming up against walls, like boundaries and walls with people in communication. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest for anybody to, like, if you can help it, to like maybe have those kinds of, like, there are certain days that I'm like, hey, maybe today's not the day. If you've been following me for a while, I say this, I'm like, maybe not this time to have certain kinds of conversations that are really meaningful. You just might find that you come up against people's like guards, their boundaries and their walls in a way that feels a little bit more cold or harsh than what you had really expected or intended, in any way. So I would just say, like, yeah, maybe just keep that in mind. I think part of what this square kind of asks us to do is consider also, just as a part of it, just a consideration is, because Mercury is not just about how we think or the details or the data and a lot of other things that Mercury is, it's also about how we communicate, obviously. For a lot of people, I think they know that. But the way in which we communicate and coming up against a square with Saturn, I think it asks us to consider how are we, because of Saturn being about structure, right? Like, how are we building people up or tearing things down? How critical are we getting? Because Saturn can get into that critical area, right? Like, so how critical are we getting with our communication, and maybe just being more conscious, being more aware of how you are interpreting, perceiving, and then communicating, right? Because the perceiving, like the perception and the thinking process, is also part of Mercury, right? So how are you perceiving? How are you thinking? How are you communicating then in a way that is like, perhaps, like, it could be a little harsh? All right, so to wrap this up, last thing I'm going to say is this can also bring in a little bit of that realist kind of like edge into things, which I don't necessarily think is bad. Like, I think it's good to, I'm an optimistic realist. That's how I categorize myself. So I don't necessarily think this is actually bad. Maybe that's part of my Mercury in Sagittarius. Maybe that has something to do with all of this, but that's the way that I view it. So I don't know if that's helpful for you, but just consider that through Friday and a little bit into Saturday, you might be experiencing some of that. And just know that the Saturn part, the Saturn square, that's going to push off. We have other things to be considering and concerned about for the rest of the weekend, and we're going to talk about that tomorrow. So tune in for tomorrow. We're going to be talking about that for sure. However, the other thing that I want to say is anyone just noticing how fucking cool my OG Pac-Man beanie is? This is my brother's. Like, it's OG from like the 80s. My older brother, who's 10 years older than me, that's his. It's mine now. All right, back to what we need to talk about. Okay, so I had to fit that in because I'm a total dork. So, Pac-Man, it has happened. I have shown it to you. Yay. Decided to go cartoon at the end. I just wanted to let you know we are going to get into the new moon, and there is some stuff that we need to talk about for this new moon and what's leading up to it. So make sure that if you're not following me on all of the socials, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, blah, 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 Facebook, is that a thing? Anyway, yeah, just make sure that you're tuned in because we're going to talk about the rest of this weekend, but I just don't have time to address it in this video. So we are going to talk about the rest of this weekend, and I think that there's a cautionary tale. I think there are some things that people need to be concerned about. I think that we need to be watching ourselves and being very aware of other people, and this is not a new moon to be fucked with. So let's talk about that tomorrow. All right, I'll see you guys then. Have a good start to your weekend. Really, do your best. All right, I'll see you then. Bye.